You can come.
Okay, hi everyone. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes and then I'll hand the mic over to Laila. And while we cook the two dishes together, we'll have a conversation about food, about culture, politics, and Gaza. And so please write your questions in the chat box, which is monitored by the volunteers, Mohammed and Miriam, that are here today. And if we have time at the end of the hour, we can do more Q&A then. My name is Amber Hurley, and I'm a docent and volunteer at the Museum of Palestinian People. I've been volunteering at the museum since August of last year. I'm not Palestinian, but I was lucky to live with a Palestinian family in Amman, Jordan. And I'm really excited for the talk today, actually, because my real introduction to Palestine was through the food and through spending many, many, many hours with my Palestinian host sister and host mom and host grandma and host cousins and aunts and cooking in the kitchen together. So I'm really excited for the conversation today, and I'm excited to be organizing it. So the Museum of the Palestinian People opened last summer, and it's a really special place. And I know that so many of you on the call today have already been to the museum. I see a lot of familiar faces, but I did just want to introduce the museum to those of you who have not been before. The museum was formed to give Palestinians a space to share, embrace, and learn about their own culture and celebrate the vibrancy of Palestinian culture and heritage. But it's also a space for people to learn about Palestine and learn about Palestinian culture. Because of coronavirus, we temporarily closed down the physical space, but we have a virtual museum, which we launched online, and you can see the virtual tour if you go to our website. And so we're a pretty small operation, as a lot of you know. We only have one full-time paid staff member, but our impact is a lot bigger. Just this year, I counted last night, and we've hosted over 900 people, either in the museum or on one of these virtual events. So we have a really big impact in Washington, D.C., but also around the world. And if you're interested in supporting the museum, there's a lot of ways to get involved. You can volunteer with the museum. You can like, follow, and share our posts on Facebook or Instagram. And then we also have a Resilience Monthly Club membership, which is $19 a month if you'd like to become a sustaining member of the museum to help us sustain these efforts and keep doing events like these. So I just wanted to thank you guys for being here today. And it's really meaningful to see so many people here for Laila's class. Laila is an award-winning Palestinian author, social activist, policy analyst, and journalist. She frequently speaks on the situation in Gaza, the intersection of food and politics, and her personal journey as a Palestinian mother and artist, as well as contemporary Islam. She's written for numerous newspapers, and I'm not going to name them all, but she's also appeared on NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, and other places. She's the author of Gaza Mom, Palestine Politics, Parenting, and Everything in Between, and the co-author of, as everyone knows, Gaza Kitchen. Not mentioned in Laila's bio is that she has a fantastic garden, which she told me all about while we were on a call this week. And so, Laila, if you want, you can give us some gardening tips while we do the recipes today, and you can tell us what came from your garden or what didn't come from your garden. But I'd love some gardening tips. So I'm going to hand it over to you to talk us through the cooking class today.
Thank you so much, Amber. Thank you to the Museum of the Palestinian People, and thank you to all the viewers for joining me today. I'm super excited. This is actually my first live online cooking class. I've done a lot in person. So I'm very excited to have this opportunity. And, you know, actually starting with the garden is a good way to introduce the dishes that I'm going to be showing you today. Because I am, for those of you who know, an avid gardener. My husband refers to my garden as my fifth baby. I have 4 children from ages 2 to 16, which keep me very busy. And so I really like and feel like both gardening and cooking, as Amber sort of alluded to, are excellent ways to be able to learn about a people and a place. It's so much more than just obviously consuming food, which is what I feel like it's been reduced to here in the US. And so what I try to do is really bring the whole Palestinian experience and identity, make it immersive for my children, who, as many other Palestinians, are displaced from their homeland. And so try to make it as real as possible for them by planting the seeds and watching, you know, the development and the growth of the seeds and nurturing those seeds. And oftentimes I use seeds that are gifted to me by Vivian, my dear friend Vivian Sansur of the Palestinian Heritage Seed Library. And then we, and I explained to them, like, this seed is a Palestinian wheat variety that is grown in Palestine. And in the spring, we would take it and we would sort of experientially make frika with it and the Palestinian roasted wheat and so on and so forth. And so I love my garden, and I also really love, and my philosophy on cooking is both sort of derived, taking cues from traditional cooking, especially cooking of the fallahin, the peasants, because they cook seasonally. So I'm a big believer in seasonal cooking and cuisine. And so that's how I decided to choose these two dishes for you. I went out to my garden, which isn't huge. I have to enclose it because, as you know, we have a lot of deer here in Maryland. And I am here, by the way, in Clarksville, Maryland, coming to you live. And I went out to see what I had growing, and I had fava beans and a lot of seasonal greens. I had fava beans, greens, and I thought, what is it that and peas. And I thought, what is it that I could, make, but that also the viewers will have access to. So I was going to choose to make a fava bean dish. Right now in Gaza, they would be making طبيخ فول أخضر, which is a fava bean stew made with lamb and eaten with yogurt and rice. And it's one of my favorites. And you fry some garlic and cilantro at the end. But I thought cooking the meat would be maybe too time consuming. And then I, thought, okay, what else do I have? And I have chard. And chard is usually thought of as a fall green, but it's also grows abundantly in the spring. And it's one of my favorites because it keeps coming back. It's actually a biennial, not, as I learned recently, not a perennial, which means it usually is productive for 2 seasons before you have to regrow it. But I love it because it's very hardy, for those of you not familiar. Now, the varieties in Gaza tend to be sort of tender leaves and young. So they would kind of really be disgusted by the ginormous leaves that we see here, but they work equally well. Whatever variety, right? You could do green chard, rainbow chard. Here, they would really be this size in Gaza, but you don't have to, feel free to use larger leaves like this as well. So these are from my garden. Some of them are from my friend's garden that I helped her plant. So that's the chard, and we're going to be making Fatteh salit وعدس. Now, a lot of you might be familiar with salit وعدس. Salit is the word for chard in Arabic, adas being lentils. And salit وعدس, chard and lentils, is a very common stew, vegetarian stew, for lack of a better word. You might want to say soup, but it's not really eaten as a soup, it's eaten as a main meal in Gaza. Now, it's also made in other parts of Palestine as well, and I believe in parts of the greater Levant, Bilad al-Sham. But in Gaza, they spice it, as they do everything else, with a unique blend of course, always chili peppers. We like to keep things hot, and dill seeds and garlic and lots of cumin. So it's really a very great and hearty dish. And the dill seed, it lends this sort of earthiness and like almost a meatiness to the dish that you don't really miss the fact that it doesn't have an animal-based protein. I do lean towards vegetable-based and legume-based dishes, but I'm not a strict, vegetarian. So anyway, that's the salit وعدس. Now, when I was in Gaza this past fall, I had a chance to go there after a few years of absence for a program I was asked to participate in with the World Food Program on food and nutrition for children. And it was an incredible experience. And I got to visit with a lot of families and share their experiences and stories with them. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But one of the things I picked up from one of the families is they take the salit وعدس and they kind of, amplify it, take it up a notch by making it a fatteh. So fatteh, for those not familiar, fatteh is a sort of a genre of dishes in which you take, pieces of, like, it doesn't have to be new, day old, actually, preferably. It works well to use leftover pieces of bread. And you fit, which is just to kind of pick it apart, tear it apart, and you add the bread to whatever dish that you're making. Usually, fatteh connotes something with an animal-based protein, like fatteh jaz, chicken fatteh, or, and it's also sort of an ancient Arabian tradition of taking bread and soaking it in broth. And, that's Gaza shares with the greater sort of Arabian Peninsula in the Middle East. But in this case, they take the bread and they make a fatteh out of the chard and lentils. And so the woman, showed me how to, very simple. You just make it as normal, and then you take the leftover pieces of bread and you kind of, dunk them in and mix them in. And then instead of serving it in a more soupy way, it would be spread on a platter and garnished and eaten that way. And it's, again, a really good and very nourishing way to be able to feed your family, especially, always, obviously, but especially in times of hardship when animal-based proteins are really not affordable to the majority of the population. And as we know, in Gaza, this has, really is an extreme example of where it is a sort of, man-made impoverishment, a situation that has been created as a result of the ongoing, US-funded Israeli siege on Gaza that has really pushed the majority of the population into food insecurity, meaning they can no longer afford to feed their families more than, once or twice a day. So 80% of the population is food insecure. And what I really found astounding when I went in the fall is the difference over the past 10 years. Is it used to be that there was somewhat of a middle class, people who had some government income, who could afford maybe like frozen, cheaper quality meats or whatever, maybe farmed fish. The irony being that you're right there on the coast, but can't afford obviously to purchase fish. But when I went this past fall, that was no longer the exception, it was the norm. So the majority of the people everybody that I visited, it was just an afterthought that they would never have chicken or meat or fish. Maybe on Fridays, if they could scrape together enough, they would have an animal-based dish like matluba, right? But that's really has become somewhat of a special occasion thing. And fish, everyone I talked to said maybe once every 6 months, right? And it wouldn't be even farmed. It would be imported Thai fish that the Israelis bring in. And there's always some sort of economic incentive involved, on their part for bringing this stuff in. So that was really tragic to me. And I also saw that a lot of people were beginning they've always consumed these sorts of legume-based vegetarian dishes in Gaza, but this has become the staple now on an everyday basis, right? So I can talk a little bit more about that later, but I'm going to get started here. And the second thing I'm going to be making is one you might all be familiar with. It's dagga or Sallata Ghazawiya, right? That's made in the zibdiya, the Palestinian clay mortar and lemonwood pestle. That's very common in Gaza. That is sort of ubiquitous and used to prep ingredients, to serve them in, and to bake in when they come in larger sizes like this, seafood dishes and shrimp stews and things like that. So dagga means pounded. And so I refer to it usually as a pounded, almost salsa-like salad made with hot peppers, tomatoes, and fresh dill. But I'm gonna do that like second so we can give the lentils a chance to cook. So the first thing that you wanna do with the chard and lentils is super simple. This thing literally, I refer to it as a one-pot meal. It comes together, in an instant. You can just put everything together in one pot and kind of let it do its thing. So we're gonna actually just take one chopped onion and we're gonna saute it in some olive oil. And let that just kind of tenderize for a few minutes, and then add the lentils in the water and let that cook down. So I totally approximate things, by the way. I'm realizing I don't have measurements here. If you are interested in exact measurements, the recipe is available in my book, The Gaza Kitchen. The third edition was supposed to have been out by now, but unfortunately due to COVID-19, it hasn't. So look for that in the fall, but I believe there's still copies available here and there. So we're just gonna kind of put a glug of olive oil, a couple of tablespoons in the pan, let that warm up a little bit. And I do like to use olive oil for everything, but I do remind my viewers that it is a luxury for Palestinians in Gaza to be able to use olive oil the way that it was intended to use. So now, because it's become, again, so unaffordable for the majority of the population, they will use aid-rationed soy or sunflower oil and only use the olive oil as a garnish or to drizzle on top of things. But I do try to keep it authentic to the way that the dishes were supposed to be prepared. So just give that a little bit of a chance to warm up, and just, put in the onions and, let that cook down for a little bit. My mother was not fond of cooking. I love her to bits, but she hates cooking. So did my grandmother. My grandmother was actually not Palestinian. She was born in Palestine, but she was half Circassian and half from Sochi and half Kurdish Syrian. And so they both hated to cook. And but one thing I did pick up from my mother is she would make a really good killer lentil soup, and that I also have in my book. And I always asked, like, but yours tastes different. And she would like, what are you talking about? It's just soup. I don't do anything. And then I observed her making it once. And then I was like, aha, that's what it is. She lets the onions kind of caramelize in the beginning, instead of just, you usually read in recipes, saute the onions until tender. She actually, on a sort of low and slow, lets them get nice and golden and sort of crusty, and then she adds everything else. And that really gives a sort of sweetness, overall sweetness to the dish that I really appreciate. So that's kind of what I like to do for the saladas as well. Get them, not like a long caramelization, just, but you don't want them to get crispy. So while that's happening, I just realized I forgot the dill. So I'm gonna grab that. That's also actually from the garden. That's another thing that is a nice spring green that you can grow, and it grows really well. Amber, back to the gardening. It grows really well next to cucumbers. So I know some people have trouble growing dill, but it does not do well in extreme heat, right? So you're not gonna be able to grow it in like July or whatever. But in partial shade or in spring or late spring, it will grow well. So I'm just gonna grab that while the onions are doing their thing.
Laila, we had one question. I don't know if you can hear me, but one person asked, you could talk a little bit, and you've already talked a lot about your life in Gaza, but if you could talk about your life in Gaza, and then also how you were able, how your family's migration story and how they were able to leave.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is the dill. Again, a very common ingredient in Gazan cuisine. So, for me, I just want to keep an eye on these onions. I don't want them to burn. So I actually didn't grow up in Gaza. Like many Palestinians, I grew up in diaspora. I was born in Kuwait. Both of my parents are Palestinian and were born and raised in Gaza. There were physicians who trained in Egypt, moved back to Gaza, lived there for a while, and then moved to the Gulf states, where, in that wave of Palestinians who went to work in the Gulf in the 1970s. So I was born in Kuwait, and then eventually they moved to Saudi Arabia, and they worked there in the city of Dhahran for the company Aramco for a long time. But it was, I always like to say our childhood was like sort of marked with political vulnerability because we were stateless. We didn't have any citizenship. What we did have was the Palestinian ID card known as the Hawiyya. And some of you might be familiar with this document. It's a document, an ID card essentially, that the Israelis began to issue in 1967 when they formally occupied the Gaza Strip. And they sort of went door to door doing a population census. And they said, okay, how many people in your household? Okay, and they would mark that down and say, okay, these people are considered, of course, they didn't use the terminology Palestinian at the time. You are Arab residents of Gaza. And they issued these ID cards and they continued to control that population registry until the present day. So this is something that a lot of people don't realize. Often we hear a lot of propaganda about, well, Israel left Gaza, like what more do you want, right? They actually still control the taxation systems of Gaza, the borders, the airspace, the sea space, the imports and exports, and very critically this population registry, meaning they determine who is and is not in their system, obviously a Palestinian resident. And the reason this is important is because that document, that Hawiyya, enabled us and enabled any Palestinian to access Gaza. So, and it's territory specific. So we had an ID card that was specific to residents of Gaza, enabling us to enter Gaza only through specified borders, and that varies by year. But at the moment, it's the Rafah crossing, when and if that crossing is open. It does not allow us to travel freely to the West Bank or to Jerusalem or to any other part of Palestine. It actually restricts our access to those places. So even though I am, would be, for example, if someone is an American citizen and you happen to have an ID card, the ID card sort of nullifies, supersedes in the Israeli system your foreign citizenship. They don't consider that. They don't, take that into consideration when you're traveling into their borders, right? And so we had that ID card, and we would travel on a regular basis back to Gaza. Because at that time, before the first Intifada, it needed to be renewed. If it wasn't renewed, you would lose that right. That, of course, is your sort of God-given right, but that they instituted that system, the Israelis, and so you would lose the ability to travel in and out of Gaza if you didn't renew it. So we would go back on a regular basis to Gaza for this reason, and of course also to see our family and whatnot. And so this sort of was formative, this experience of traveling across borders and having to wait for hours, sometimes days at a time, and never knowing whether or not we would be allowed in, was formative in sort of my understanding of the Palestinian experience, and one that I'd like to share with people till this day. I'm gonna continue, but I'm gonna add in the chard and the lentils so that I can give that a chance to cook. So I've already cut some of the chard down. it can really be a rough cut. I mean, I've done sort of thin ribbons or medallions here. And again, I didn't tell you how much, but they usually, if you don't have it in your garden, they usually sell them in these standard really large bunches. So like one bunch is good. Maybe if you want to make a larger batch, 2 bunches. It does sort of wilt down, kind of like Spanish would, but I would say somewhere in between like kale and spinach. It retains some form, and you know, I get a lot of questions about what to do with the stems. You can actually cook them with this too. If you want the uniformity of the green color, then you might not, but some people pickle them. But I like to throw them in there because they're nutritious, and if you do them small enough, you won't really notice the difference. I don't like to like waste any kitchen, you know, ingredient from my garden. So I'll make like pestos out of my fava bean leaves and salads out of the pea shoots and things like that. So I'm just gonna throw that in there. So they've just, you see, nice little ribbons of the chard.
Mohammed, one of our volunteers, said, my mother used to cook them with the stems, which was his favorite part of the dish.
There you go. So yeah, I find there, I mean, that was one of the first things I noticed when I came to the US is like how much waste there is. It's unbelievable. And anyone familiar, I'm gonna put a little bit more, I have a few more right here. Anyone familiar with the Palestinian kitchen knows that there is a real emphasis on, you know, like sort of economizing and reducing waste and things like that. So every part of a vegetable will be used. You know, if you core a squash, kusa, you use that pulp to either make like with bed, like a scramble with eggs, or in my mother's case, she throws them into lentil soup. So, and I really like that. And it, you know, teaches us to respect also the bounties that we were sort of given. All right, so you don't need to cook this down a lot. You just, see if I can show this to you without like scalding myself. Hang on. I have a tendency to chop my fingers off and burn myself when I'm doing these things. So you see, it's still like sort of nice and green. You don't need to cook it down. You just throw the lentils in there in the water and let it do its thing. So I'm just gonna do that quickly. And I have here, I would say about a cup of lentils, red lentils, right? You wanna rinse them once or twice, wash them out. Sometimes there's little stones or dust in there or whatever. All right.
And then water in with the lentils or just the lentils?
That's exactly right. So I have about, you know, I would say 1.5 liters, which is like 6. I have about 7 to 8 cups of water here. I would say 7 cups if you really want to go by cups. But again, I'm just kind of eyeballing it. You want to like essentially, you know, when you're making rice, you just barely want to cover the rice by about 1 inch. In this case, I really submerged the lentils, and I'm going to show you here. I submerged them quite a bit with water. I don't want to spill them out, but so, because, you know, the lentils will now soak up a lot of the liquid. Now, in this case, remember, we're making a feta, so I'm not so concerned with the liquid because, you know, the bread will soak up a lot of that liquid, so we can always adjust as necessary. But yeah, like roughly a cup of lentils, a bunch and a half maybe of chard, and I would say something like 6 to 8 cups of water, something like that. So it's a very forgiving dish. So it's not like, you know, you need to be exact or worry about being exact. So anyway, but back to what I was saying before we go on, I think we have a little bit of time right now. So we would go back, we would renew our ID card, and this, you know, but our relationship with Palestine was always sort of marked with like a lot of question marks, like what, you know, what was it to be Palestinian? You know, we always felt like a little bit distant, and you know, and I think that was sort of by design, right? You know, a lot of this, the way that the borders and the permit systems were designed by the Israelis was exactly to make Palestinians feel estranged from their homeland and, you know, dispossessed from the actual earth, right? And from the traditions and the culture. And I did sort of feel that way, but, and so we would go back and we would meet our cousins and family and you know, and the sort of revolutionary songs and throughout the first Intifada and the curfews, and we experienced all of that in small doses. But it was always confusing to me because I felt like Palestine was a series of, I always say, dates and numbers that I needed to memorize. And there was an urgency to making sure this history was never forgotten by my mother. Like, don't forget 1948, don't forget like Land Day, don't forget 1967. And I was like, oh my gosh, and what happens if I forget? Like, will I cease to be Palestinian? Where will this history go? And the one thing that I always say was very material that did connect me, that I knew, you know, was real, was the food, right? So I always say, like, I eat, therefore I am. And so I would taste these dishes, and I recognized early on that amongst the Palestinian community where we were in Tehran, there was only a few families from Gaza, that our, you know, food was very distinct from the rest of Palestinian food. And I always kind of wondered why that was, but it made me want to prod further. And it, you know, always in the back of my mind, I thought, wouldn't it be great to be able to actually explore this further and codify this knowledge before it's lost? A lot, especially a lot of these kind of more unusual dishes that are made on special occasions or were made by a lot of our grandparents, that some of them in disuse, some coming back into fashion. And a lot of it, most of it was just oral knowledge at that point, right? Before the internet, and so that was kind of the way my interest into food started was like that. It wasn't by, you know, kind of curling up next to my grandmother or mom who showed me how to make a batch of like gag, you know, that never happened. If anything, I was like shunned away from the kitchen by my grandmother and yelled. If I asked her about food, she considered it kind of offensive because she was like much better than that. She knew like 7 languages and memorized books, and she was a teacher and a superintendent, and she's like, why are you asking me about food? Like, of all the things to ask me about, you know? So anyway, so that was, and then eventually, you know, I came to the US for college and then moved back to Gaza after I finished my master's, and I worked there for a long time as a journalist while I was raising my son, who's now 16. And again, that was also, you know, I think marked a second stage in my understanding of what it meant to be Palestinian. And I feel like really when I sort of came into my own and recognized that we should not rely on other people as Palestinians to tell our stories for us. We need to kind of narrate our own stories, no matter how trivial or mundane we might think they are. It is that triviality, I think, that enriches people's understanding and our own understanding of the Palestinian experience. And for a long time, we were relying on, you know, specifically in the 90s, like, you know, legitimizing white male figures to tell our stories for us. And I feel like now that's no longer the case, but for a long time it was. And I think it was, you know, made worse by the fact that a lot of media agencies wouldn't take a Palestinian, you know, as they wouldn't maybe any sort of indigenous figure seriously if they were telling their story, right? And there wasn't access to the same kinds of networks and research, you know, outlets to be able to share these stories. And it was at that point that I thought, wow, people really seem to get it. When initially I thought, gosh, nobody wants to hear about my you know, desperate search for size 3 diapers in the middle of a blockade in Gaza. But it turned out people did, you know, and it turned out that it made the experience of being Palestinian in Gaza so much more real for them and relatable. And it was after that that I decided, you know, this is the way to do it. You need to just be comfortable in being able to relay your own stories and use whatever sort of venues and lenses you think are useful because they ultimately are the ones that I find to be the most credible, right? And so that I started, initially I had my blog discussing my, you know, mothering in Gaza, and then eventually turning to food as lens and being able to relay and share the Palestinian experience. So I don't know if there's any more questions as we're waiting. If not, I'll go on.
I mean, do you want to start and then we can chime in?
Yes. So what I'm going to do now is, as this is cooking down, and it shouldn't take that long, I'm going to add the flavorings, right? So right now we have in there the sort of nicely caramelized onions, the olive oil, the chard, and the lentils and water. Now we're going to add like the flavorings, right? So again, super simple. You want, you know, maybe a teaspoon of salt. My mother would die right now if she saw me doing this. Like, why are you not measuring it? She's like the opposite of everyone else. But, you know, just a generous, like, maybe generous, whatever, little fistful, half of this, maybe a fistful isn't the right word, but like a nice big pinch, I guess. And then dill seeds, right? So dill seeds are one of these ingredients that are central to Gazan cuisine. You'll find them in almost every dish. And it's kind of weird because they're not as easy to find, I think, as we like to think. They are sometimes available in Turkish and Persian markets, but not really in other Middle Eastern markets. You can find them in Palestinian markets if you live in the DMV or in Maryland. Al-Quds market, Jerusalem market has them in the Woodlawn area. So you want about a teaspoon, of these. And, it's interesting why dill in Gaza, I don't know, where it's not really consumed elsewhere in the immediate proximity of Gaza. You will see like fresh dill in Egypt, they refer to it as shebat, but really dill seeds and green dill in the rest of Palestine are not consumed at all. And I remember growing up, we had a really hard time finding dill in Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, and we had to rely on this kind of underground network of travelers that we knew were going there to, to bring dill back for us, in addition to a few other things like knafa Arabiya, the Gaza-style knafa that was only available in Gaza. And so it might be because Gaza, was at one point the main port along the Mediterranean. It might be because of its proximity by sea, at least, to Greece and Cyprus. Who knows? But for whatever reason, dill is one of those things that is, consumed with great enthusiasm in Gaza. So you put the dill and the salt in here, the dill seeds.
Really quick. Someone asked if they weren't able to find dill seeds, if there's a good alternative to compensate for them.
That's a really good question. Dill is in the family of like cumin and so forth. So I would say if you really couldn't find dill seeds, but by the way, I don't know where this person lives, but you can order them online. So I found them like, in like bulk. I get them in sometimes 1 pound packages and keep them in my fridge. So you can find them online, but if you really can't find them, cumin seeds, I would say would be the next best option. Yeah. So, and then what you want to do is, I can't travel without my zibdiya, right? But another good alternative, if you don't, they're really hard to obtain. I'm trying to work with like the Rebuilding Alliance in California in eventually getting exports of these out of Gaza, which I think would be great. But the next best thing would be like a rough stone or granite, not stone, mortar like this, or the Mexican moljalita, right? Used to make guacamole. But you don't want a smooth or like wooden one, because that won't give you the same effect. You want it to be rough from the interior, right? And so the idea is you're gonna, in a circular motion, go like this with the dill seeds, right? Not pound them. And then you keep doing this, and you want like a coarse grind. You don't want it to be a powder. And you'll smell the fragrance of like the dill oil, the essential oils wafting. And once that happens, that's what you want to happen. You want to break down the dill seed until you get to the essential oils. And my grandmother, this is something, again, she hated cooking, but she would always make me do this if I happened to be around, because it was very, laborious. And she would always say, I would go like this. I was a very like scrawny and like anemic child. And I would go, and she would go, no, put some muscle into it when you're doing it like this, So this always reminds me of her, may she rest in peace. So you really do want to get a nice, like, firm grind on this as you're doing it. Yeah, and then it smells amazing. And so, you see, it's kind of a rough grind there. And then what we're going to do next is put some dried red chili peppers. And actually, these are from Gaza. I got them in the fall, so I feel like they're very special. But if you can't find dried red chili, and they need to be hot, then you could always use red chili pepper flakes. That works just as well, right? So, and by the way, you could also make this without. My husband is from the north of Palestine, and he can't tolerate any heat whatsoever, which is tragic for me, but what am I to do? So I always make this without, and then like add the chilies on in the end, right? So he thinks we're like a different species in Gaza. He always says, but in Gaza, they make things this way. I don't know what, but in Gaza. So anyway, I like it hot. So I'm gonna put a few of these in here. And then, again, same thing, circular motion, and the nice thing about using the whole ones is it gives you sort of more texture. I don't like uniformity. In a lot of these dishes in Gaza, you don't want things to just be smooth. And so you get some like big chili flake pieces, some small ones, some seeds, and that's all okay. So again, just a rough grind. And then next, garlic, right? So some people refer to this as the as the, you know, in I think in Louisiana cuisine they refer to the trinity of Cajun cuisine, right? Like celery, red pepper, and onions, I think, or garlic, something like that. So they refer to this as the equivalent in Gaza, which is garlic, dill seeds, and chili peppers. So you want about 5 garlic cloves. I do have garlic in my garden, but this specific one, I don't think it's quite ready yet. So this is not from my garden. And again, you want to just pound these, not in a circular motion, pound them until they're kind of well mashed. And you know, when you're using, if you do have a zibdiya, make sure you stabilize it with one hand, otherwise it could crack. But the nice thing about the zibdiya is if they're fired correctly, they're unglazed, they will keep for decades, right? If they're done correctly, they have a nice thick rim, and they get really nicely seasoned as well, which I think is fantastic. We met people when we were doing the research for the book who referred to their zibdiyas as their children. This one guy we met was like, you know, this is like my 4th child, and he held it like this and was like, I've had this for 27 years, you know. And you'll always, if you meet a Gazan in diaspora, you can rest assured that they will always have zibdiyas. It's one of the most prized possessions. So again, mashing the garlic here, and then the last thing will be the cumin, right? So again, about a teaspoon of cumin. And cumin, a lot of people might already know this, but it's anti-flatulent, for lack of a better term. So it helps counteract the effects of things like lentils and chickpeas and whatnot. So you'll always see it in Gaza added to food, you know, the fava bean mash, to hummus, to anything with any kind of legume. Is it legume or legume?
Legume. I think legume.
I always get that one wrong. I'm always hesitating to say the word because I think it's such an odd word. Okay, so I'm gonna add all that stuff in now.
Okay, someone asked the question, could you talk about the benefits or the difference between chopping garlic compared to smashing it?
Okay, really good question. I find that when you mash the garlic, sorry, 1 second, I'm just gonna throw that in there. When you mash the garlic, it isn't quite as offensive in the sense that things break down and it's easier to digest. And you know, versus when you're just chopping it, you get kind of rough bits of garlic that, you know, are more difficult to consume and digest, but also don't really blend well into the dish. So don't lend the entire dish a kind of garlicky flavor the way that mashed garlic would, right? And I know a lot of people in Gaza when we were working on the book told us the same thing, that if you mash it, it is you know, again, lends better flavor to the dish and is easier to consume, to digest. So, and always with salt helps break that garlic down, right? Versus if you just try to mash it alone. But if you really didn't have a mortar or pestle, one way that you could mash it, which I have done sometimes when I've been traveling, is you stick it. I'll show you 2 ways actually. One is a garlic press. So I have one lying around somewhere. That works. You know, it's not as efficient, but it's better than just chopping it. So a garlic press, or if you really didn't have either, you just take a piece of garlic like this, put it on a chopping board, and use the base. I don't know where my use the base of a wide like butcher knife, and the base of your palm, and then you just go like this, and you go, and it sort of mashes, right? And you can do that a few times, and you get nicely mashed garlic that way. So this is, you know, sort of a easier handheld mortar and pestle. So, you know, maybe you could practice that a few times. It's kind of therapeutic either way, whether it's the knife or the mortar and pestle, especially when you're dealing with like a teenager and toddler. Sometimes. So, any other questions before we move on to the salad?
Someone said that you're a pro, which you definitely are at doing the garlic.
I always like to add that, by the way, I didn't grow up doing this, so I really didn't know anything. I loved being in the kitchen, but a lot of what I know, I learned, you know, and continue to learn. So I always tell people, don't be afraid to learn something new, or it's okay to, you know, we're never too old to learn. I'm always learning, and every time I, I know some people are very like, this is the way we do things and there's no other way, but I love to learn new techniques. And whenever I visit different families. I'm like, oh, I never knew that you could do it that way. Or some people will add something else. So I'm always learning. And I still like to remind people, I still get super excited when I flip a pot of matluba, and it comes out perfectly, whatever, round, cylindrical. I still get excited about that. So trust me, that's only something I feel like I mastered relatively recently, like in the past 3 years. So don't feel bad if you haven't gotten that one down. Maybe I'll do a separate class on that, because that
would be great. I would like to have that feeling too.
Okay, so we're gonna make the dagga, the salad now. And again, I'm using another one of these bowls. I'm gonna use one that's slightly larger. But again, if you don't have this, I would strongly advise you, you're not gonna be able to find this unless you're in Gaza. I would strongly advise you to get something in the same category, like this one works well too. Because this one is really hard to make if you don't have some kind of mortar and pestle. People have said to me like, oh, food processors, and I'm like, no, this really should not be. Honestly, I would rather you make this by hand, just mushing things by hand, rather than use a food processor. That's how strongly I feel about this. So again, a nice generous pinch of salt. And then we're gonna start, now I should say, precursor to this, that there's a lot of variations, and people have very strong feelings about these variations. I remember once I was just asking for people's opinions on Facebook when I was writing the second edition of the book, and I just wanted to know, like, how do you make dagga, like in your household? And people who lived literally were from a street apart were like, it is never made with garlic. This is not dagga. And some others would say it is only made with onions, and you always add like, you only use dill greens, not dill seeds. So people feel really strongly. Honestly, any combination of what I'm about to tell you works, right? So salt, obviously, dill seeds, optional. I like to put both dill seeds and dill greens. In Gaza, when they don't have the fresh dill available in the summer, they will use like the dill seeds. I find that like adding both kind of gives you different flavor profiles. So, again, about a teaspoon, depending on how much you're making, maybe a teaspoon for every 2 medium-sized tomatoes, I would say. And so you always start in the mortar and pestle with the dry ingredients first, right? You don't start with the garlic and then add the dill seeds, because you won't be able to grind them. That's why I switched mortars and pestles. So again, you're gonna give that a nice grind, circular motion. Man, it is really hot in here, isn't it? Do you feel it's hot? Okay, so that's done. Next, garlic. And if you don't, again, if you weren't using dill seeds, you would skip right to the garlic, right? Now, I know a lot of people are rolling their eyes thinking garlic, eek. No, you don't put garlic in dagga. If you don't want to put garlic, again, my husband can't tolerate like garlic with chilies. I skip the garlic. Some people say it's only made with onions. So if you didn't want to put garlic, you would take a small bulb of an onion, not a large one, and very finely dice it, right? And then this is what you would add instead of the garlic, right? The onion. So I'm gonna put like 3 small cloves. And then in this case, you really need to mash it. This is a circumstance where you should not have chunks of garlic. Absolutely not. It'll taste horrible, right? But again, if you didn't have a mortar and pestle, use the knife method and then just keep doing it until it gets nice and pulpy. And if you add a generous pinch of salt, it will get nice and mashed, even if you do it with a knife. Remember what I said before, I would much rather you do it by hand and not use a food processor. So mash that garlic until it's really nice and mashed, And I like to give this anecdote of when we were doing this in Gaza. And this one man that was showing us how to make it, I'm just gonna check on the lentils really quickly. They're almost done. He said to us, yeah, Yusuf Abu Sofia, he said to us, keep mashing the garlic until it's really like a pulp. And then we're like, okay. He's like, no, you need to get this step right. Really mash that garlic. Okay, I'm like, okay, we got it. He's like, no, you don't understand. You have to just keep mashing it. And so we kept emphasizing this point over and over. But his idea being you really don't want bits of raw, pieces of raw garlic in your mouth. So, so that's done. And then next, so again, salt, optional dill seeds, garlic or onions, peppers. This is a nice ancho pepper from my garden. These are jalapenos. Serranos work well. Serrano pepper works well too. In Gaza, they have their own, oh wow, thunder. It's like I don't know if everyone can hear that. Yeah, it's like an intense thunderstorm. Huh? Sorry, slight PTSD thinking back to being in Gaza right now every time I hear thunder. they have their own variety of pepper in Gaza that I keep wanting to. I actually knew a friend of mine who smuggled them across the Erez crossing to the West Bank in like her scrubs. She was a volunteer doctor. I thought it was hilarious. She said, they came to search me and then I got really nervous and I was sweating and I had peppers in my pants and my pockets, and they said, empty your pockets, you have something in there. And then I was getting nervous and then I said, what? And then they said, oh, it's just she had a tissue, and she was like, phew. And so she was like so proud of the fact that she got these chili peppers out of Gaza. Unfortunately, I have yet to get that out. So it's insanely hot, you know, the one they have in Gaza. The only peppers I would not use here is like, you don't want to use Scotch bonnet. Thai chilies don't work well either. I've tried that. You know, don't want to use habanero. So something in the range of jalapeno, serrano, ancho, that works well. So I want to say, depending on how hot your peppers are, 2 to 3, again, for medium, small sized zibdia. Some people like to take the seeds out. That's optional. You know, you could leave them in either way. If you want it not to be so hot, you can. Sometimes people don't like the, you know, the membranes and the stuff in there. So it's really up to you. And then again, this could be a coarse chop. The nice thing about this is it's very, you know, it's very easy to put together and accommodating. So I'm just taking some of those seeds out there because these, I find the jalapenos here in the US tend to have much more like seeds and membranes in Gaza. So it can kind of get in the way. So by the way, when you're doing this, either wear gloves or wash your hands thoroughly with soap and water after. Because trust me, I've made the mistake of chopping really hot chilies and then going to pray, making wudu, like ablution, and washing my face. Yeah, not fun. My face was like on fire for 40 minutes. So. All right, so that's done. I'm just gonna put 2 in for now so we can go on to the next step. And then again, I just have them in, you can, you know, it makes it easier to mash if you make them in small chunks, but you know, these are pretty, they don't have to be uniform, and I don't like them to be tiny. Sometimes I've had people chop them like in minuscule. And remember what I said before, what I like about a lot of these dishes is the texture and the lack of uniformity. So I don't necessarily like them to be teeny weeny little pieces. And then again, you're gonna mash. Now the chilies will not get mashed to a pulp the way the garlic was, but you do wanna break them down so you're not eating pieces of like large chunks of chilies. And I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So just pound them down for a little bit. And you know, parents used to always say, you want dagga to be more green than it is red, meaning it should have the ratio of chilies to tomatoes and other ingredients should be higher. So I'll show you what that looks like in a second. So you see, it's not like a pulp, but you have nice kind of macerated chilies in there. And then next, the tomatoes. My tomatoes are not quite ripe, unfortunately. So these are just kind of like hothouse tomatoes from the supermarket, but almost, maybe in a couple of weeks. And same thing, just kind of like tomato chunks, doesn't need to be teeny weeny little pieces. Hey, do you mind like rinsing these for me? Thanks. I forgot to do that. I'm just gonna check on the dill because I don't want it to scald the bottom of the pot. All right, so the chard and dill should almost, the chard and lentil should almost be done. So as soon as we finish this, I'm hoping. I was doing this once in Malaysia and I was going so quickly and there was a TV camera filming and it was an insanely large sharp knife and I was going and then I looked and not to gross people out, I saw my finger on the chopping board and I was like, oh my God, that's my finger, you know, and I like held it really quickly and I was like quickly, you know, it was like live but nobody could notice, and thankfully the organizers knew a really good plastic surgeon that sewed it back on. Sorry, was that TMI? Okay. Oh, okay. Good times.
Terrifying.
My finger now. Okay. So just dump those tomatoes in there. And then, you know, again, remember what I said before, if you don't have a mortar and pestle, at this point, I would be going like this. Use your hand is the best food processor, you know? So just mash it with your hands because ultimately that's what you want to do here. think of it, remember I said as a salsa, like, salad. We say salad, but salad kind of connotes a kind of sort of Western leafy salad, which this isn't, right? So throw that in there. And then just pound, pound, pound until it gets nice and pulpy. And this works really well when you have those kind of overly ripe, tomatoes, summer tomatoes oozing with juices that they might even sell, at a, on sale, and sometimes they sell them in bags in the supermarket or your farmer's market for half price. This works really, those tomatoes are perfect for this, right? So you could take advantage of those summer bounties. The tomatoes that would usually be discarded or used for canning are perfect for tenga. Because the juicier the tomato and the riper the tomato, the easier it is to mash it, obviously, and the more flavorful. So I'm going to show you what it looks like in a second. And again, if you didn't have dill greens, you could even stop here and finish, right? But so here we are. Again, if you like it to be hotter, you would add more chilies to it. I'm going to add a little bit of the fresh dill. You don't want to add too much of the fresh dill because it will overwhelm the dish. So you don't want to add like a huge bunch. I would say, again, for lack of a better measurement, like a fistful maybe of small little palmful of chopped dill, right? There's plenty, because otherwise it really can get bitter and overwhelm the dish. So again, mince the dill. Some people like to put it in there and pound it, but it's hard to, get it. It'll get crushed in there, but not minced. So I like to mince it first and then toss it in there. And then you could just kind of use a spoon if you wanted and just mix everything together. And it smells amazing for those of you following along. I love dill. You can maybe give it another mash. I feel like the ones on the bottom didn't quite get mashed as well. And then you want to just clean up the rim of the mortar and pestle. Yes, I like to use my hands in case you're wondering. My mom used to always say, my brother, I don't know if he's watching, whenever he would see her use her hand like a spatula, he would go crazy, like, what are you doing? Don't use your hands. And she would like put everything down and go, these hands have made wudu 5 times today and they're cleaner than any utensil you have in your kitchen. So I tend to agree. We have a big emphasis in Middle Eastern kitchens on fastidiousness and cleanliness, and something that dates back to the medieval Abbasid era. So I agree, use your hands, And then finally, you're gonna put a nice generous drizzle of olive oil. Really, you wanna top it with a thin layer of olive oil, not just drizzle it, right? So it's gonna look something like this. And that will be served with the bread. Oops. Now, some people like to put a drizzle of lemon. You could do that too. Goes well with and then you would eat it with, scoop it up with the bread. So I'm gonna go back to the dill now. Put this here for a second. And we're gonna finish it off and then maybe take some questions. All right, okay. So the chard and lentil should be done. And we already put in our flavorings. I'm gonna see if I can bring it to you and show you what it looks like. So it's not gonna be like, remember what I said before, it's not gonna be uniform. So you see, but the lentils are definitely cooked through, right? And that's what you want. And so it's okay if you have leafy bits of chard. I prefer it that way. So what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take the leftover pieces of bread, and it's fine if you have a new loaf of round of Arabic bread is fine too. In Gaza and the rest of Palestine, they refer to what's known here as pita bread as Kamesh. And I do have a recipe for that in my book of really nice homemade Kamesh. And nobody would really traditionally use commercial yeast. They would actually just borrow naturally made, I guess sourdough starter, naturally leavened made yeast starter from each other. And I actually was able to finally successfully do that during the whole, sheltering in place period, which was really fun. And so here I just took sort of stale few-day-old bread that I had in the fridge, because this is a great use for it. And you're just gonna sort of, with your hand, cut it into chunks like this and toss it in there. And then we're gonna transfer it to the platter, right? So just literally throw it in there. And then you can also taste and see if you need a little bit more salt, maybe. Honestly, you could really use any type of bread here. I just would caution against using like white, sweet, refined bread because you don't want it to be so sweet. But really, if you have like leftover pieces of whatever, a sourdough loaf or, whole wheat bread, that would work fine too. But I would toast it first, right? You don't want it to otherwise it'll get really mushy. So this is kind of stale and dry, so I didn't really need to toast it. But always try to toast your bread before you put it into, when you're making a fattah. Okay, so that's done, and I'm just mixing it together and giving it a chance to like soak up the bread. And then adjust whether you need more bread or not. I think it needs a little bit more. This is really great in the fall, again, I made it because I happen to have a lot of chard, but it's really good on like a kind of cool fall evening when you want something kind of, warm and comforting. So I'm gonna you want a sort of a wide platter for this, right? And scoop it on here. And as it cools, this isn't something that you would serve piping hot, this particular variation of salu'adas, because it has the bread. So you want it to kind of be maybe room temperature or give it a chance to cool and congeal, right? Put that in there. And it might be hard to see from over there, but I'll bring it over in a second.
Laila, someone asked if the dish would be good without the bread and would firm up because they want to make it gluten-free and they're concerned about the texture of gluten-free bread.
So actually, I have a little experience with that because for about a year, I was making everything gluten-free for my husband because he has Crohn's. And we were, experimenting to see whether that was something that would help alleviate his symptoms. And as many of you know who are familiar with Palestinian cuisine, it's incredibly difficult to cook gluten-free because there's wheat in everything, right? But thankfully I even made hand-rolled gluten-free maftoud, which was amazing. So you can absolutely make it with gluten-free bread. And, again, this is a very forgiving dish, right? The idea is just to use leftover whatever thing that you have type of bread and throw it in there. And you can absolutely make it without bread. In fact, the original way that it's made is without bread, right? It's just salu'adas and it's sort of, it would be more loose and liquidy, right? Almost like a stew. And just eaten that way with a bunch of other accompaniments, pickles and things like that. I just wanted to show you the spin, the variation that I learned on it, which I thought was kind of less common. So yes, feel free to do whatever. It's a very forgiving dish. If you were doing it without the bread, you would obviously serve it in more of like a, sort of a bowl rather than a platter, right? Okay, I think I'm gonna hold off on the rest. I don't want to overflow the dish. All right.
And are you putting liquid into it when you spoon it out, or is it just the?
So actually, what I did is I saw how much liquid was in the dish. And I put in bread, and you want to give it a few minutes to kind of soak up the liquid. And if it seems like there shouldn't be, when you make this type of fattah, of salu'adas, there should not be liquid in the platter, right? It shouldn't be liquidy. And so if you find that it's a little bit too liquidy, what you want to do is add more bread, right? Or just kind of set the liquid aside. So, because in this case, it's something you want to be eating either by hand or with a spoon communally. It's not going to be something, so there shouldn't be liquid in there. And then here comes the garnishes. When I was in Gaza, it was great. One of the women that I got a chance to spend some time with, and I don't even know where I put here it is. She really did a really lovely job garnishing it with, these are pickled lemons, but you could do regular lemons, and pickled chili peppers. and really whatever you have on hand. She had put some olives on there as well, which I thought was nice. And I went out to my garden. She had some fresh arugula. My arugula didn't do so well this year, but I'm going to be a little bit fancy schmancy, and I have arugula flowers. So I thought they're really pretty. I'm going to put them on there. And I have little baby arugula leaves. So again, this is all optional, but it makes it really pretty. And, you know, you eat with your eyes, as we all know. So feel free to kind of experiment, having the focus be on seasonality and whatever happens to be available in your garden, in your farmer's market, in your fridge. I'm really a fan of just using what you have on hand and improvising, right? I always tell people, don't be afraid to improvise and try, you know, staying true to the nature of the dish, but don't feel intimidated and feel like I don't have a zebdia, I can never make this, or I don't have pickled peppers, therefore it's a bust, right? Just, you know, be forgiving with yourself, with the dish. She also had some nice, pretty carrots, and I think that's, again, I just love pops of color. So, you know, again, feel free to do
green onions on it.
Yes, green onions. I have some. She did have green onions on there. They're in the fridge, but I'll just put that on later. But again, you know, I guess I'll just leave it here. So this would just be eaten, you know. I guess everyone can see, get a good view of the dish there. Maybe I'll go like this, give you an aerial view. How about that? And then there's the vegga. And so again, you know, this should be eaten communally. And traditionally, fettahs are eaten by hand, right? You all get together and you go like this. If you don't feel comfortable with that, you can use a spoon. But remember, my mom said, your hand is always cleaner than any spoon. So, but you know, we always say Bismillah, which just means in the name of God before we eat. And then, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So good. So you get it's just like an explosion of flavors. That's what I love about, you know, all of Gaza's flavors. You get the dill, you get, you know, the pungency of that dill, the earthiness of the cumin, you get the heat from the chili peppers. And it's just kind of like all going off in your mouth like fireworks. It's amazing. It's perfect. Doesn't need any more salt, doesn't need anything. I love it. And again, because it has the bread in there, it's just like a whole meal, right, in and of itself. Okay. So simple, one pot, one platter. And then the degga, you would scoop up with, you know, with bread wedges like this. And you would just go like that for those who aren't familiar. And then you would just eat it. Also amazing. I miss it because, again, when you're cooking for a family, not everybody likes everything. And so I really miss cooking like the traditional dishes, you know, the way they were meant to be made and consumed. Sorry, no offense, family. I'm so happy you guys could join me today. I hope I didn't go too fast. I hope you learned something new. I hope you try these dishes at home. And I would love to, if we have time, you know, anyone has any more questions, or you, Amber, I know you had some things that you wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a couple of minutes here, we're happy to take more questions, either for those of you tuning in on Facebook Live or on the Zoom chat. Facebook, this is a good question. Someone on Facebook asked where we can buy your book.
Good question. You know, at the moment, I think it's actually, I want to look, I think the only place that it might be available is some local stores in DC. So I believe, does the Museum of the Palestinian People have any?
Middle East Books and More, which is right underneath the museum. For those of you in DC, it's on 18th and T. There's a great Middle Eastern bookstore, and they have many, many copies of your book. The last time I was
there. Because we're all out of stock at Just World Books. And I'm just looking to see, I think there's even on Amazon, I would much rather you support local independent bookstores, but it's also out of stock actually on Amazon. So definitely, if you can, get to downtown Washington and get a copy, because they're not printing any more of the second edition, but inshallah, soon the third edition will be out. And we're super excited about that. There'll be a few new recipes that I picked up from my time there, and some new anecdotes and sort of input.
And for those of you who aren't in DC, Middle East Books and More is, you can probably reach out to them via email and see if they'll mail you the book. They're very nice and they're partners of the museum. And someone else asked, a couple of people have asked about making this dish with different types of lentils, using brown lentils or green lentils if they can't find red split lentils. Can you talk about what the different kinds of lentils are and what you could use for this dish? Or
Yeah. So I believe in Syria and Lebanon, they actually make a variation of this without any of these spices, with brown lentils and and you could use spinach if you didn't have chard, by the way. However, we do not do that in Gaza. Those will not break apart, right? So the advantage of the red lentils is, or the split lentils, is they break apart, they cook in like less than 20 minutes, right? The brown lentils will not do that. They retain their shape. Now, that being said, if you really couldn't find red lentils, which is, hard to imagine because you could find them pretty much anywhere, but if you really did not have them on hand, you could try to use the brown lentils. They'll just take much longer, brown or green, to break down. So they will eventually break down, but it'll take like an hour or something. And they might need a little bit of help by mashing them down. And in fact, there's another dish in Gaza that they make called adas mdammas, smothered lentils, that's made with brown lentils. And they're left to cook, slow cook over a very long time and totally fall apart, and then topped with a dressing of chili and garlic and lemon.
Thank you. And someone else asked how the editions of your book change between editions. It sounds like you add more recipes and you do a little bit more reporting for each edition. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so, again, none of this was kind of like knowledge that secondhand knowledge. I mean, it was some of the things I knew, right? Obviously, with my mother cooking this, but my mother is from the south of Gaza. And remember, her grandmother was Syrian, half Kurdish, so she didn't grow up making a lot of these dishes. My father made a lot of the seafood dishes, being from Gaza City, and I picked those up from him. But there's a lot of sort of micro-regionality in Gaza, because I know that you had asked about this, Amber, before. But remember that the majority of the population of Gaza, something like 75 to 80%, are not actually natives of Gaza itself. The Gaza Strip, as a term, as a territory, is a construct, an artificial construct that was created in the aftermath of the Nakba in 1948 in a joint agreement between the Egyptians and the Israelis, actually. And what happened is, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from towns and villages surrounding what is modern day Gaza poured into what would become the Gaza Strip, and the borders were sealed around them, right? And they were prevented from ever returning to their homes. And so the majority of the population are not natives of Gaza, and they brought with them this incredible, like I said, micro-regionality and variation of different cuisines, some from the tradition of the villages. The eastern villages outside of Gaza don't use a lot of garlic or chilies, a lot of relying on seasonal cuisine and root vegetables and greens and things like that, legumes. And then you had those coming from Jaffa with its rich culinary heritage and seafood, sophisticated seafood cuisine. And you had some coming from as far as Beersheba, with their traditions of the sort of more Bedouin areas of Palestine. And so you do find incredible variation in the cuisine in Gaza. And so in the book, the various variations of the book, we tried to honor that as much as we could. And inevitably, I would learn some new spin in my travels. Somebody would say, I noticed that you didn't have this in the book. And I'm like, oh my gosh, tell me about it. And then I would say, okay, inshallah, if I do another variation, I promise you I'll add that in the book. I really wanted to honor that and have this be, I know a lot of books that have come out subsequently in Palestinian cuisine have like these modern kind of like, sort of sexy spins on the food, like a dollop of this and whipped this and whatever, a drizzle of that. But this one was really one that I wanted to honor the tradition as much as possible and present it as a sort of codified text to Palestinians themselves. And so that was really as important as being able to relay the message to the greater world. And so that's what happens in each variation. I pick something else up. I realize that I made a mistake or that I wrongly interpreted something, so I correct it. That happened a couple of times, especially the more sort of arcane dishes. So that, that's sort of the extent of it.
Wonderful. And for everyone who is watching this on Zoom, if you can take a photo of what you made, you can email it to the main Museum of the Palestinian People account, and we'll post it on our social media or just share it between the group. But we'd love to see what you've made.
Absolutely. And I will do one quick shout out to my brother and chef, Sani Tamimi, who I've had the pleasure of collaborating with on numerous occasions. And hope to do again soon. We're hoping to do actually a virtual conversation. But shout out to his book, Palestine, that just came out. in the US, and he's not able to be here personally, but I know he worked very hard on that, and it was kind of his first foray into Palestinian cooking. So check that out as well.
Thank you. And everyone is saying, thank you, Laila, thank you, MPP, and asking you if you can please do this again. And so I just wanted to say thank you again for doing this, because it's been really informative and fun. I have mine here, if you can see.
Good. I would love to see. I'm not so good about like self-promotion and doing these things, so I always welcome an opportunity. I know people are always like saying, check this out. I'm doing this again, 4 kids, a household to manage. I just never have the time, so I always welcome a chance to be able to do these in an organized way. We locked all the kids with a box of donuts downstairs, and we were like, nobody is to come into the kitchen for this end. So thank you again to the Museum of the Palestinian People and to everybody watching. And you know, I love the encouragement, and I love hearing from you. It does really give me, you know, bolster me and you know, push me up when I go into kind of this, you know, dark place where I'm like, I can't do this, I don't have time. So it's great. I support your, you know, fellow artists and writers and chefs and so on.
Well, thank you so much. And we'll see everyone next week. We're going to be doing events in July too, weekly. And hopefully we can have you, Laila, back here.
Yeah, I would love to have this be like a regular thing. Thanks again, everyone, and happy eating and stay safe.
Thanks.